In this section, we're going to learn about working with AJAX. AJAX is short for Asynchronous JavaScript in XML, which is kind of a misnomer now because a lot of times we don't work with XML so much when we're working with AJAX. Let's look at an example of an application that uses AJAX, and that's Google search engine. So when you start typing in Google Chrome's browser line, it is sending the data you're typing. Every time you type a character, it pulls the data out of there and it sends it to Google. And Google sends you back a piece of information that they use to update the list of possible things while they're trying to guess what you're going to be typing. So that's their auto suggest, right? So it's not reloading the entire page. It's sending a little bit of information and returning some information, and they're using JavaScript to update the text that's appearing on this page of these suggestions. Okay, so that's AJAX. Rather than making a full HTTP request and a response and loading a brand new page every time, we make a little behind the scenes request and pull a little bit of data that we use to update the current page. So you can see this is traditionally how an HTTP request happens. We make an HTTP request, it goes out to a web server. The web server might contact the application server, which may contact a database server to get some data. It comes back, the application server might wrap that in some HTML to give back to the web server, but it sends you back a brand new HTML page, and that loads in your web browser. So an HTTP request with a full page coming back as an HTTP response, regardless of what's happening in the back end over here. AJAX works a little bit different. So we initially would get a web page from our web server, but then as the page is running, it makes a small AJAX request to the web server, and the web server just sends back small pieces of data that are used by JavaScript to update the current page. So AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript in XML. We use something called an XML HTTP request object when we're working with XML, and you'll see coming up that we don't always work with XML. A lot of times we're working with something called JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. It's kind of replaced XML in some of these. We're going to look at the fetch API. The web service is the service that's running on the server where we make our request, and it's running an application programming interface. So that web service, we contact the API, and it's what sends us the data back. And we'll see how those things are used in upcoming videos. So when AJAX runs, it used to return XML. That's where the X comes from in AJAX. So XML is extensible markup language, and usually we can have a file with a .xml extension. But that's been replaced now because XML is a little verbose, meaning there's a lot of code in there and it's a little bit hard to read. JSON is JavaScript object notation, which is basically just key value pairs, and it's a little bit easier to read and it's way more concise. And we're going to see examples of both of those coming up. So those are the two formats. I'm going to deal mostly with talking about JSON. We'll look at XML and how to process it, but we'll actually do more examples with JSON. Because if you're writing a new application today, you're probably using JSON. There may still be a lot of code out there that might use some XML in the background, but most things are being updated to JSON, and anything new is almost always using JSON. Okay. So here's an example of some XML data. So HTML actually was developed from using this idea of XML. So here's some data, and you can see we have management here. So it does look like an HTML tag. We have here's the beginning of our management section, and here's the end of the management section. Okay, and here is the definition of a team member and the closing for the definition of the team member. And a team member has a name, a title, and a bio. So here's the beginning of the name, here's the end of the name, and Agnes is in the middle. It looks a lot like HTML. Remember, XML, though, came first in HTML, kind of copied it. It used the standards of XML when they created HTML language. Okay. So for each team member, we have a name, a title, and a bio. That's what XML looks like. Let's look at the same thing written with JSON notation, JavaScript object notation. It's a little bit easier to read. And remember, I said they're key value pairs. So we have team members, colon, and then a value. This whole thing is the value. It ends with this open square brace and closes here. But that value, here's the key, here's the value. Inside that value, we have more key value pairs. Name, Agnes. Title, President of Accounting. Bio, with over 14 years of public accounting. So you can see JSON compared to this is way easier to read. I believe it's way easier to read. A lot less characters, a lot less in characters are bytes and bits, and it takes data. So this will be a smaller file as well. So JSON is the new way. Almost everything now is written with JSON. So we've talked about XML, extensible markup language. We've talked about JSON, JavaScript object notation.